On January 16, 1970, at 15:30 hours, the last operational B-58A Hustler, serial number 61-2080, taxied off the runway at Grissom Air Force Base, Indiana, and into storage at Davis-Monthan. Strategic Air Command's fastest bomber had flown its final mission. Within 5 years, every airframe would be scrapped, their titanium and aluminum sold for roughly $179,000 per aircraft. The planes that cost taxpayers $12.44 million apiece went for pennies on the dollar. But the document that sealed the Hustler's fate had been circulating inside SAC headquarters months before that final taxi. A 1969 operational readiness assessment, portions of which were later referenced in declassified SAC historical studies, laid out the paradox in terms that left no room for bureaucratic hedging. The B-58 had set 19 world speed records, some of which still stood at the time of its retirement. It could deliver nuclear weapons at Mach 2 at a time, when nothing else in the American inventory came close. Its crews were among the most skilled in SAC, handpicked from the top tier of bomber pilots. And yet the same assessment noted an operational loss rate that hovered around 22.4% of all airframes produced. Of 116 B-58s built, 26 were destroyed in accidents. 1 out of every 4.5 Hustlers ended up as wreckage. General Bruce Holloway, who commanded SAC from 1968 to 1972, reportedly called the aircraft unforgiving, a word that shows up repeatedly in official correspondence from the period. Not dangerous, not defective, unforgiving. The distinction mattered to the men who flew it because the B-58 didn't malfunction its way into those statistics. It performed exactly as designed. The pilots who couldn't keep up with its demands paid for the gap. So, how does an aircraft that rewrites the record books, that represents the biggest jump in strategic capability in a generation, get retired after barely a decade of operational service, while the lumbering B-52, older, slower, subsonic soldiers, on for another half-century and counting? The answer involves money, physics, institutional politics, and a body count that even SAC's most committed advocates couldn't rationalize away. The Hustler didn't fail. The math just stopped working. By 1951, Soviet air defenses had deployed over 10,000 radar-guided anti-aircraft guns ringing Moscow alone, with SA-1 Guild surface-to-air missile batteries entering testing that same year. The math was already turning against subsonic penetration. A B-47 Stratojet, cruising at 607 miles per hour, gave Soviet radar operators roughly 45 minutes of tracking time on an inbound approach, enough to scramble interceptors, calculate firing solutions, stack defenses in depth, and still have time left over. Curtis LeMay, then commanding SAC, understood the arithmetic better than anyone. In his 1965 memoir, Mission with LeMay, he wrote bluntly, "We had to get faster, or we had to get higher, preferably both." Convair had been working the problem since 1949 under a study contract designated GEBO-2, Generalized Bomber Study. The original specification called for something absurd by the standards of the day: a bomber capable of sustained Mach 2 flight at altitudes above 50,000 feet, carrying a nuclear payload over intercontinental range. Every established aircraft manufacturer looked at those numbers and proposed incremental improvements to existing designs. Convair's Fort Worth division, led by Chief Engineer Robert H. Widmer, threw out the conventional playbook entirely. Their proposal featured a delta wing with conical camber, area-ruled fuselage, and an external weapons pod that doubled as a fuel tank, a configuration so radical that Boeing's competing design looked like a warmed-over B-52 by comparison. The Air Force selected Convair in August 1952. What nobody in the Pentagon fully grasped was that building a Mach 2 bomber in the early 1950s meant inventing half the technologies required to fly it. Aluminum airframes couldn't handle sustained kinetic heating above Mach 1.6, where skin temperatures climb past 240 degrees Fahrenheit. Convair's solution demanded extensive use of brazed stainless steel honeycomb sandwich panels, a manufacturing technique that existed mostly in laboratory settings. The adhesive bonding processes alone required temperature controls measured in single-digit tolerances. Every subcontractor in the program was being asked to manufacture components at the bleeding edge of metallurgical science. The aircraft hadn't even been designated B-58 yet. The production challenges were already without precedent. The honeycomb panels that rolled off Convair's Fort Worth production line in 1956 were barely thicker than a silver dollar. Two thin sheets of stainless steel bonded to a corrugated core, the whole sandwich measuring 0.20 inches in some fuselage sections. At Mach 2, these panels had to withstand not just aerodynamic loads, but thermal cycling that swung from minus 70 degrees Fahrenheit at cruise altitude to over 240 degrees on the wing leading edges within the span of a single acceleration run. The brazing process required to fuse them demanded furnace temperatures held within plus or minus 5 degrees across ovens large enough to hold entire fuselage sections. Convair built custom furnaces for the job. When early production runs showed unacceptable delamination rates, they rebuilt them. Robert Widmer's Delta Wing was the other gamble. A 60-degree sweep with conical camber gave the B-58 low supersonic drag and enough fuel volume to make the range numbers work without the wing looking like a flying gas tank. But Delta Wings carry a penalty that aerodynamicists understood perfectly well in 1952 and chose to accept anyway. At low speeds, specifically during approach and landing, a pure delta generates lift primarily through high angle of attack. The B-58 touched down at approximately 180 knots with its nose pitched 14 degrees above the horizon. Pilots couldn't see the runway over the nose during the final phase of landing. They flew the approach on instruments and faith. The wing also produced vicious pitch-up tendencies at certain angles of attack. Widmer's team addressed this with small canard-like vortex generators on the forward fuselage. But the fundamental characteristic remained baked into the airframe. The aircraft demanded constant, precise pilot inputs at low speed in a way that no previous bomber had. A B-52 pilot transitioning to the Hustler found that speed was the least of the adjustment. The relationship between control input and aircraft response had changed fundamentally. The margins between stable flight and departure from controlled flight were measured in single-digit degrees of angle of attack. The delta made the B-58 possible. It also killed the pilots who couldn't keep up with what the delta demanded. Carswell Air Force Base sat adjacent to Convair's Fort Worth plant, close enough that the first YB-58 prototype, serial number 55-0660, was towed across the taxiway to the flight line without ever touching a public road. On November 11, 1956, test pilot Beryl Erickson lifted it off the runway for a 38-minute maiden flight. The aircraft reached Mach 0.9 before Erickson brought it back. Everything worked. The celebration was premature. Within 18 months, the flight test program had consumed its first airframe. On June 16, 1958, ship number 55-0665 crashed during a low-altitude pass at Carswell when the pilot lost control during a pull-up maneuver. The crew of 3 died. The investigation pointed to the same pitch-up characteristics Widmer's team had been wrestling with since the design phase. Knowing about a problem and solving it in flight were never the same thing. Edwards Air Force Base in California's Mojave Desert hosted the bulk of the envelope expansion testing, and the desert floor started collecting wreckage at a pace that alarmed even hardened test pilots. Between 1958 and 1962, the test program lost 5 aircraft, a rate that the Air Force Flight Test Center's own historical records describe as significant even by the standards of 1950s experimental aviation. For context, the B-52 test program lost 2 aircraft total during its entire flight test phase. The Century Series fighters, the F-100 through F-106, had brutal early accident rates, but those were single-seat fighters expected to push limits. The B-58 was a bomber carrying 3 crew members per sortie. Every hull loss tripled the body count. The escape capsule system deserves a detour. Convair and Stanley Aviation developed an enclosed ejection capsule specifically because conventional ejection seats couldn't protect aircrew at Mach 2. The wind blast alone would be fatal. The capsule was supposed to clamp shut around the crew member, pressurize, and rocket clear of the aircraft. During early testing, the capsules had a distressing tendency to tumble rather than stabilize after ejection. Bears were used as test subjects in capsule ejection trials at Holloman Air Force Base. The results were mixed enough that crews flew for years knowing their escape system was, at best, a coin flip. By the time the B-58 was declared operationally ready in August 1960, the test program had already contributed a sizable fraction of that 22.4% loss statistic. The operational squadrons would add the rest. "We were flying so fast that the sun came up in the west," Major Harold Confer told Air Force interviewers after completing Operation Heat Rise on March 5, 1962. His crew, navigator Captain Richard Weir and defensive systems operator Captain Howard Bialas, had just flown B-58A, serial number 59-2458 from Los Angeles to New York and back in 4 hours, 41 minutes, and 14.98 seconds, averaging over 1,044 miles per hour for the round trip. On the westbound return leg, they outran the Earth's rotation. The flight won the 1962 Bendix Trophy and set 5 individual speed records in a single sortie. That was the thing about the Hustler's record campaign. The aircraft didn't accumulate records one at a time through cautious, carefully staged attempts. It stacked them in bunches, often setting 4 or 5 marks during flights that SAC had already scheduled for operational testing purposes. Between 1961 and 1963, B-58 crews claimed 19 world speed and altitude records recognized by the Fédération Aéronautique Internationale, more than any other bomber in history before or since. The first major record fell on January 12, 1961, when a crew from the 43rd Bombardment Wing flew a payload-to-altitude mission that put 4,400 pounds above 85,360 feet. 6 records in a single day, the Blériot Trophy, awarded by the FAI for the most outstanding flight of the year, went to B-58 crews in both 1961 and 1962, the only military aircraft to win it consecutively. The Thompson Trophy, the Mach Trophy, the Bendix, the Blériot, the Hustler took every one of them between 1961 and 1963. Operation Greased Lightning on October 16, 1963, was the longest of these flights. Captain Robert Sowers, with crew members Captain Robert McDonald and Captain John Walton, flew 59-2458, the same airframe Confer had used for Heat Rise, from Tokyo to London in 8 hours, 35 minutes, and 20.4 seconds, covering 8,028 miles with 5 aerial refuelings. Average ground speed across the entire route exceeded 938 miles per hour. The flight won the 1963 Mach Trophy. These weren't publicity stunts. SAC used the record flights to validate operational procedures, aerial refueling at supersonic cruise profiles, navigation system accuracy over oceanic routes, crew endurance at sustained Mach 2, and thermal management in cockpits that climbed above 120 degrees Fahrenheit, despite air conditioning running at maximum capacity. The crews wore pressure suits for the duration. 8.5 hours strapped into a cockpit narrower than a phone booth, breathing through a helmet, decelerating periodically to meet tankers, then pushing back through the Mach. 19 records. Enough trophies to fill a wing headquarters lobby. And the entire time the records were accumulating, so were the accident reports. Those went into a different cabinet. A different audience read them. The cockpit smelled like rubber and sweat. Pressure suit hoses fed breathing air that tasted metallic, and the canopy sat close enough to a pilot's helmet that turning his head meant brushing plexiglass. 3 crew members sat in tandem in individual cockpits separated by bulkheads. The pilot up front, the navigator bombardier behind him, the defensive systems operator in the rear. They couldn't see each other. They communicated by intercom. At Mach 2, if something went wrong, The pilot had roughly 2 seconds to make the correct control input before the situation became unrecoverable. The 43rd Bombardment Wing at Carswell received its first operational B-58s in March 1960. The 305th Bombardment Wing at Bunker Hill Air Force Base, later renamed Grissom, stood up its first Hustler squadron in May 1961. Between those two wings, SAC would operate every B-58 that Convair built. The transition training pipeline was, by all accounts, savage. Pilots arriving from B-47 and B-52 squadrons found an aircraft that punished complacency in ways subsonic bombers simply couldn't. Colonel James K. Johnson, who commanded the 43rd during its early operational period, described the B-58 qualification course as the most demanding flying training program in SAC in official wing histories. What made it so demanding wasn't the speed. Pilots adapted to Mach 2 faster than anyone expected. At 50,000 feet, speed is mostly a number on a gauge. The problem was everything below 10,000 feet. Landing the Hustler required a stabilized approach at 180 knots with that 14-degree nose-up attitude, using a combination of instruments and a periscope-style optical sight mounted in the lower fuselage. Crosswind landings were particularly unforgiving. The Delta Wing's low-speed handling meant that a gust correction applied 1 second too late could put the aircraft into a roll from which recovery at 200 feet above the ground was theoretical rather than practical. SAC's answer was repetition carried to an almost obsessive degree. Hustler crews flew more training sorties per month than any other bomber crew in the command. Simulator time. Primitive by modern standards but functional enough to replicate the approach profile, consumed hundreds of hours per crew annually. The washout rate for B-58 transition training ran between 25 and 30% in the early years. 1 in 4 pilots who showed up at Carswell with bomber experience and excellent records couldn't meet the standard. They went back to their previous airframes. Nobody held it against them, but nobody reversed the decision either. The ones who stayed became something unexpected. George Miller, a former B-58 pilot who later wrote about his experiences for the Daedalus Flyer, recalled that Hustler crews developed an esprit de corps that bordered on arrogance. We knew we were flying something most pilots couldn't handle, and we were proud of that. The rivalry between the 43rd and the 305th during SAC bombing competitions became legendary within the command. Hustler crews won the Fairchild Trophy, SAC's top bombing and navigation competition award, repeatedly, outscoring Wing's flying aircraft with far more forgiving flight characteristics and newer avionics. Crews did tame the man-eater. But what it cost showed up in the maintenance logs, the fuel bills, the accident summaries that kept landing on generals' desks at Offutt, and the personnel rosters that kept getting shorter. 47,000 square feet of Delta Wing. That was the number Convair's engineers kept coming back to when SAC asked the question nobody expected them to ask in 1962. Can this thing fly on the deck? The question had an ugly origin. Soviet SA-2 guideline missiles had shot down Gary Powers' U-2 at 70,500 feet in May 1960, and by 1961, intelligence estimates put the SA-2's effective engagement ceiling well above the B-58's optimal cruise altitude of 50,000 to 55,000 feet. The entire strategic rationale for the Hustler, fly high, fly fast, outrun everything, had a hole in it. SAC's response was to explore low-altitude penetration profiles for the entire bomber fleet, including an aircraft specifically designed never to go there. Nobody had predicted what came out of the low-level trials. The enormous Delta Wing, the same wing that generated so much drag at high altitude, the aircraft burned fuel at rates comptrollers found physically painful, performed brilliantly down low. The wing loading, the ratio of aircraft weight to wing area, came in around 87 pounds per square foot at combat weight, substantially lower than the B-52's 120 plus. In turbulent air below 1,000 feet, where updrafts and downdrafts slam an airframe dozens of times per minute, low wing loading translates directly to ride quality. The Hustler rode rough air like a Cadillac on fresh asphalt. A brief aside on what ride quality means at 600 knots and 500 feet. It means the difference between a crew that arrives at the target capable of operating their weapons systems and a crew so battered by vertical accelerations that they can barely read their instruments. B-52 crews flying low-level profiles routinely reported fatigue so severe that training missions were limited to 90-minute segments below 1,000 feet. The Hustler could sustain the profile longer with less crew degradation. Former B-58 pilot Richard Rutan, who would later gain fame for his non-stop unrefueled flight around the world in the Voyager, described low-level Hustler flights in published interviews as the finest ride in the Air Force. The terrain-following profiles SAC developed for the B-58 between 1963 and 1965 gave the aircraft a second life, a mission relevance that the original weapon system 302A specification had never contemplated. The airplane designed to sprint above the weather had been given a reason to exist again, and the reason was dirt and turbulence at 500 feet. The alert shacks at Carswell smelled like stale coffee and floor wax. Fluorescent lights hummed around the clock. Crews slept in their flight suits on narrow bunks arranged in rows. Boots positioned precisely beside each bed for a scramble that could come at 0300 hours on a Tuesday, or never come at all. A klaxon would sound, that particular buzzing wail that every SAC crew member heard in their sleep for years afterward, and the crews had 15 minutes to be airborne with live thermonuclear weapons. From August 1960 through the end of 1969, B-58 Hustlers sat on nuclear alert at both Carswell and Bunker Hill, loaded with the weapon pod's MC-1 payload, a single thermonuclear device in the megaton range. 1/3 of each wing's operational aircraft maintained continuous ground alert at any given time, parked on dedicated alert pads with crews rotating through 7-day shifts. The routine was monotonous by design. Monotony meant the world was still functioning. During the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, SAC raised its alert posture to DEFCON 2, one step below nuclear war. Every flyable B-58 at both bases was uploaded and positioned on the alert pads, crews sleeping under the wings in weather that dipped into the low 40s at night. General Thomas Power, Commander-in-Chief of SAC, deliberately transmitted his DEFCON 2 order in the clear so Soviet signals intelligence would intercept it. He wanted Moscow to know. The Hustlers on those pads carried enough combined yield to eliminate multiple Soviet cities, and they could reach their failsafe points faster than any bomber in the inventory. That speed, the same characteristic that made the aircraft so expensive to operate, was precisely what gave the alert posture its teeth. What the crews actually did during those 7-day alert rotations was mostly wait. They studied target folders and played cards. They ran through emergency procedures until the checklists felt like muscle memory rather than reading. Former 305th Bombardment Wing Navigator Major Robert Brandt recalled in a reunion interview published by the B-58 Hustler Association that you lived with the knowledge that your specific targets were real cities with real people, and if you ever actually flew the mission, you probably weren't coming home. The one-way range on many of the assigned profiles, deep penetration into Soviet airspace at low altitude, which burned fuel at punishing rates, exceeded the fuel available for return. Crews understood this. SAC planning documents from the Single Integrated Operational Plan confirmed it. The deterrent held. No klaxons ever led to a combat launch. The Hustlers sat on their pads through the Berlin crises, through Cuba, through every confrontation of the 1960s, J-79 engines cold, weapon pods armed, crews waiting in rooms that smelled like floor wax. Whether the B-58 specifically contributed to Soviet restraint, or whether it was simply one component in a massive nuclear triad, is a question strategic theorists still argue. The crews who pulled those alert shifts didn't have the luxury of debating theory. They had target folders and countdown clocks, and the knowledge that success meant never flying the mission. $12,440 per flight hour. That was the operating cost SAC's comptrollers calculated for the B-58 Hustler in fiscal year 1964, roughly 3 times the per-hour cost of the B-52 Stratofortress, an aircraft that carried 4 times the payload to comparable range. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara's Systems Analysis Office at the Pentagon didn't need a slide rule to see where this was going. They had one anyway, and the numbers it produced were damning. The B-58 fleet of 86 operational aircraft consumed maintenance, man-hours, spare parts, and JP-4 jet fuel at rates that would have sustained a B-52 force nearly 4 times its size. McNamara's whiz kids, the young analysts he'd brought from Rand Corporation and Ford Motor Company to impose quantitative rigor on defense spending, reduced the Hustler to a cost-per-delivered megaton calculation. By that metric, the B-58 lost to everything in the inventory. But cost per flight hour was only the first blade of the scissors. The second was attrition. By 1965, 22% of all B-58s built had been destroyed in accidents. 26 airframes out of 116 produced, including test articles. The crew fatality rate tracked the airframe losses with grim consistency. The training pipeline couldn't replace experienced crews as fast as the aircraft consumed them, and each replacement crew required months of specialized instruction that no other bomber program demanded. General John Dale Ryan, who served as SAC's Commander-in-Chief from 1964 to 1967, acknowledged in congressional testimony before the Senate Armed Services Committee that the B-58's operational costs and loss rate were factors that could not be ignored in force structure decisions. That phrasing, "could not be ignored," was SAC's way of conceding the argument while refusing to say the word unaffordable. Meanwhile, General Dynamics, the corporate successor to Convair, was pitching the FB-111A as a supersonic replacement. McNamara loved the FB-111 concept because it used the F-111's existing production line and promised commonality savings with the tactical variants. Its unit cost ran roughly 60% lower than a hypothetical B-58 replacement. The FB-111A would carry fewer weapons over shorter range with a smaller crew, but the cost curves pointed in the direction McNamara's office had already decided to go. SAC didn't want the FB-111. The command wanted to keep its Hustlers, or better yet, get the B-70 Valkyrie that had been canceled in 1961. It got the FB-111 anyway, and the FB-111 turned out to be mediocre at the strategic mission. But that's a different procurement failure for a different day. On November 15, 1969, the 305th Bombardment Wing at Grissom stood down its last B-58 squadron. Carswell's 43rd followed weeks later. The retirement ceremony was brief. Airframes were flown to Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Tucson, where ground crews drained fluids, removed classified equipment, pulled anything reusable, and positioned the aircraft in rows on the desert hardpan. Some sat there for years before the smelters got them. A few survived as museum displays, static, engineless, stripped of the systems that once made them the fastest operational bombers on Earth. The accountants had won, as they usually do. The question nobody in McNamara's office ever answered was what the deterrent value of speed had been worth during those October nights in 1962, when Hustler crews slept under wings loaded with live thermonuclear weapons and the world held its breath. Serial number 61-20800 was already cooling on the ramp at Davis-Monthan when the paperwork caught up. The retirement assessment documents that SAC filed in early 1970 reduced the entire B-58 program to a statistical summary. Airframes produced, airframes lost, flight hours accumulated, cost per sortie. The numbers were precise. They were also, in a way that only bureaucratic documents can manage, completely beside the point. 116 aircraft built, 26 destroyed in accidents. That 22% attrition rate, the number that earned the Hustler its reputation as a man-eater. 36 crew members killed, 19 world speed records set, 5 Bendix and Thompson trophies collected. And a low-altitude penetration capability discovered almost by accident that gave the aircraft a strategic relevance its designers never intended. The documents recorded all of it with the same flat affect, A speed record and a fatal crash got identical formatting. What the retirement paperwork couldn't capture was the contradiction at the center of the program. The B-58 was the most dangerous operational bomber SAC ever fielded. It was also the most capable one for its specific mission set. Neither fact negated the other. The aircraft that killed 36 crew members in peacetime was the same aircraft that reached its fail-safe points faster than anything else in the inventory during the 13 days of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The honeycomb delta that demanded more from its pilots than any bomber before or since was the same airframe that rode low-level turbulence better than the B-52 at twice the speed. McNamara's cost-per-delivered megaton calculation was correct. So was SAC's argument that speed had a deterrent value the spreadsheets couldn't quantify. The math worked on both sides. The equations were different. The B-58 Hustler served operationally for 10 years, from 1960 to 1970. Its replacement, the FB-111A, never matched its speed or its altitude capability. It couldn't match the alert response time either. The B-52, the aircraft that cost one-third as much per flight hour, is still flying today, 70 years after its first deployment. On January 16, 1970 at 15:30 hours, 61-2080 touched down at Grissom for the last time. Total fleet flight time, logged across the entire B-58 program, 255,000 hours. Cost per hour, adjusted to the final fiscal year, $12,440.